I used to believe the ocean was silent, just water pressing against steel walls, nothing more. But on my first night in the Mariana Trench facility, I learned the truth that silence down here is never empty. It listens. We had 11 rules carved into the walls of the lab, rules so strange and strict, they felt less like safety guidelines and more like warnings from another world. I remember the first time I almost broke one of them, the way exhaustion dragged at my eyes, and something waited in the dark to see if I'd fail. That's when I realized the rules weren't about science at all. They were about survival, and the worst one of all was about sleep. When I first arrived at the facility, they sat me down in the orientation chamber, a narrow room lined with flickering monitors and the low groan of the ocean pressing against the walls. The supervisor leaned close as he read from the manual, his voice flat, as though he'd said it too many times before. Buried between pages of technical jargon, there it was, Rule 1, never fall asleep alone in the trench. I thought it was a joke, something made up to spook newcomers like me, but when I looked around the table, the others weren't laughing. Their eyes carried a heaviness I couldn't quite name, the kind of weight you only feel when fear becomes a habit. The first night they assigned me to the upper quarters with another technician named Harris, a broad-shouldered man who smelled faintly of oil and salt even in clean clothes. The bunks were lined side by side, each no more than a metal frame with thin padding and a strap to keep us from rolling in the subtle shifts of pressure. I wanted to ask him why we couldn't sleep alone, but the way he tightened his straps and turned away from me told me it wasn't a conversation he cared to have. The lights dimmed on a strict timer, humming out one by one until the room was steeped in a shadow that felt thicker than air. I lay awake waiting for something to happen, unsure if the rule was superstition or science. That's when I heard it, the faint drag of movement beyond the walls, too slow to be current, too heavy to be fish. In the morning, Harris was already awake, sitting upright with his back to the wall. His eyes were bloodshot, as though he hadn't slept at all, and when I asked, he only muttered, "You'll understand soon." Breakfast in the mess was mechanical. Trays slid across counters, the metallic tang of preserved food, the low murmur of voices that never rose above a whisper. Everyone seemed exhausted, their faces pale, lips cracked as though dehydration clung to them, despite the endless water outside. No one spoke about the noises at night, and no one had to. The silence at the table was its own admission. I realized then that the rules weren't suggestions. They were lines drawn between life and something I wasn't ready to imagine. The days settled into routine, calibrating sonar equipment, logging samples, repairing seals that bent under pressure, all while the facility groaned like a tired beast. Hours blurred together, marked only by the shrill buzz of alarms signaling work shifts. Yet night always returned, creeping down the corridors like a tide that couldn't be stopped. I shared quarters with Harris again, and again I tried to sleep, though sleep came only in fragments. I'd wake to the sound of him muttering in his half-dream, or worse, the silence broken by faint knocks reverberating through the steel. I wanted to believe it was the metal contracting, but each sound came too deliberate, too patient, as though waiting for acknowledgement. The longer I stayed awake, the more I felt it, something pressing close on the other side of the walls, something that understood the rhythm of our breaths. On the fourth night, exhaustion became my enemy. My eyelids dragged, my body begged for rest, and Harris warned me not to fight it alone. He shook me awake when I slipped under too fast, gripping my wrist harder than necessary, eyes wide and terrified. "Don't," he whispered, voice hoarse, "not without me awake." That was the first time I realized the rules were designed not to keep us safe from accidents, but from something intentional. The facility was isolated, yes, but isolation was not the danger. It was the attention it drew from whatever swam in the silence outside. That night, as Harris finally drifted into shallow rest, I forced myself upright and kept my eyes on the narrow window slit above the bunks. What I saw wasn't movement, not exactly. It was the absence of it, a shadow darker than the trench itself, lingering, stretching along the glass as though studying me. I told myself not to blink, not to breathe too loudly, but eventually my body betrayed me. My head dipped, the heaviness of exhaustion dragging me into darkness. In that moment, I swear I felt something brush against the walls of the facility. Not a current, not a passing creature, but a deliberate touch, like a fingertip trailing against glass. I startled awake, my heart pounding, but Harris was still beside me, his chest rising and falling in shallow rhythm. Nothing in the room had changed, yet the air felt different, colder, as though I'd narrowly avoided something I wasn't supposed to see. The image of that dark shadow lingered behind my eyes, burned there by some instinct older than reason. Over the next week, I learned how the crew handled the rule. No one was ever left to sleep alone. If a shift change left someone without a partner, another crew member would volunteer to stay awake beside them, sacrificing rest just to make sure the rule wasn't broken. It wasn't camaraderie, not really, it was survival. The fear of being the one left alone seemed worse than exhaustion itself. I overheard one of the engineers mutter that a technician in the early days had fallen asleep by himself in the storage bay. They said he was gone by morning, not missing in the sense of running away, but simply gone. His bunk was empty, his belongings still there, and not a trace of him ever found. No alarms, no breaches, no proof that he'd even left. Only silence, and the faint drag of something along the outer hull. Harris grew weaker as the days passed, his body thinner, his skin almost translucent under the harsh lights. He was too tired to argue anymore, too tired to stay awake when I slipped towards sleep. One night, his breathing grew uneven, hitching like he was caught between worlds. I shook him, desperate not to be left alone, but his body wouldn't respond. He was trapped in a sleep so deep I couldn't reach him. My own exhaustion pressed harder, and I realized I was now living the very situation the rule had warned me about. I tried to stay awake, pacing the small room, pressing my palms to my face, whispering to myself. But the longer I fought, the more I felt something waiting. The silence outside seemed to lean closer, hungry, patient, aware of my failing strength. The last thing I remember before losing the battle with sleep was the feeling of the floor vibrating softly under my bare feet. It wasn't the hum of machinery or the groan of pressure. It was rhythmic, like the faint reverberation of something moving, searching, approaching. The shadows at the window deepened, swallowing what little light remained, until it felt as though the room itself was sinking deeper into the trench. My body crumpled against the bunk, my eyes fluttering closed, and in that moment of surrender, I thought I saw a shape lean close against the glass, larger than anything that should exist at this depth. Then everything went black, and I realized too late why they told us never to fall asleep alone. When I woke, my throat was dry, and my chest ached as if I'd been holding my breath for hours. Harris was gone, his bunk empty, the straps dangling loose as though he had left in a hurry. The room smelled faintly of salt and rust, stronger than usual, and for a few seconds I wasn't sure if I was still dreaming. That's when I noticed the overhead lamps flickering weakly, their glow fading in and out until the corners of the quarters melted into shadow. I remembered the next line of the manual, as clear as if someone whispered it in my ear. Rule 2. Keep the lights on during every sleep cycle. My stomach dropped because Harris must have forgotten. Or worse, the power had failed when I drifted off. I scrambled to the wall panel and slammed the switch until the bulbs steadied, their glow filling the room in a pale hum that felt more like relief than light. The silence pressed in thickly, broken only by the faint hiss of the ventilation system. Harris still hadn't returned, and I debated going after him. But the memory of that shadow against the glass pinned my feet in place. Instead, I strapped myself back into the bunk, staring at the ceiling until my eyes burned. I told myself the rule was simple enough. Just keep the lights on, nothing supernatural about it. But then I noticed the scratches along the bottom of the bunk frame, just inches from where my hand rested, were thin gouges carved into the metal. They curved upward, uneven and jagged, like marks made by something that didn't belong in human hands. The next morning, Harris reappeared at breakfast without explanation, his face pale and eyes bloodshot. He didn't look at me when I asked where he'd gone, just muttered that he had been reassigned for a shift. I wanted to believe him, but the way his hands shook as he gripped his tray told me something else had happened. Around us, the mess hall felt different too. Lamps along the ceiling were dimmer, several flickering in a slow, almost rhythmic pattern. No one commented, but I saw the way people shifted uneasily, eating faster than usual, their eyes darting toward the shadows creeping between tables. If the lights were failing, that meant the rule was being broken across the facility, and no one wanted to admit it. That evening, I decided to test the system myself. I followed the humming corridors down to the maintenance deck, where rows of humming generators lined the walls. The heat was unbearable, sweat rolling down my neck as I checked the panels. Everything looked normal, the dials steady, the gauges in range. But then I saw it. Beneath the lowest generator, streaks of condensation pooled across the floor, forming shapes that looked like handprints pressed from the wrong side. I bent down to wipe one, and my palm came away wet and trembling. It wasn't water, not exactly. It clung thicker, almost gelatinous, and carried a faint metallic odor that burned my nose. My skin prickled with the knowledge that whatever caused it wasn't part of the facility's design. That night, I made sure every bulb in our quarters burned at full brightness. Harris turned in his bunk without a word, curling away from me, leaving me with the weight of unspoken fear. Hours stretched on, the hum of the lamps blending into the beat of my heart. Just when my body started to sink into restless half-sleep, I noticed it. The shadows weren't staying still. Along the far wall, beneath the glow of the lights, something shifted like smoke bending against a current. I blinked, thinking it was exhaustion playing tricks, but the movement grew sharper, a ripple of darkness stretching long fingers across the floor. I froze, every muscle stiff, and forced my eyes to stay open. The shape stopped just short of my bunk and waited, as though testing the boundary where light still reached. I don't remember when my eyelids finally betrayed me. Maybe it was minutes, maybe hours, but I woke to silence heavier than before. The lamps overhead were still glowing, yet they no longer felt strong enough. The air was cold against my skin, colder than the trench water outside, and the bunk beside me was empty again. Harris was gone. My chest tightened as I scanned the room, then froze when I noticed the straps on his bed weren't just undone. They were shredded, frayed like something had torn through them. My instinct screamed to run, to find anyone, but before I could move, the lamps above flickered once, then twice, plunging the room into near darkness. The blackout lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to hollow out my stomach and freeze my blood. The lamps flared back to life in an uneven buzz, their glow too dim to push the shadows fully away. Harris's bunk remained shredded and empty, the torn straps swaying slightly as though something unseen had brushed them. My throat was dry when I remembered the next warning carved into the manual. Rule 3. Do not answer if someone calls your name after lights out. At that moment, the rule seemed absurd, yet my gut clenched with the certainty that Harris was already gone because of it. The corridor outside was silent as I crept toward the mess hall, each footstep echoing longer than it should have. The facility always carried noise, ventilation, water pumps, distant hums of machinery. But tonight everything felt muted, as though the trench itself was pressing its ear against the walls. When I reached the common area, a handful of crew sat scattered at tables, all with pale, restless faces. They spoke in murmurs too low for me to catch, but every eye flinched to the ceiling whenever the lights dipped. I wanted to ask about Harris, about the shadows, about the rules themselves, but I knew what the answer would be: silence. Down here, questions were as dangerous as the things lurking outside. Later, back in the quarters, I strapped myself in alone, the absence of my bunkmate a weight heavier than the trench above. The lamps hummed overhead, weaker than before, and the shadows inched closer to the floor. I told myself to stay awake, to fight the pull of exhaustion, but my eyelids closed and opened in restless intervals. Sometime past the shift alarm, I stirred to a voice. It wasn't muffled or distorted. It was Harris. He spoke my name in the same rough, low tone he used when warning me not to sleep. My heart slammed against my ribs, and for a moment instinct screamed at me to answer, to ask where he'd been. But the rule echoed louder. Do not answer if someone calls your name after lights out. The voice came again, closer this time, dripping with exhaustion. Come on, get up, it said. The way Harris had whispered during drills. The straps around my chest tightened as my body fought against silence, desperate to respond. Every fiber of me wanted to believe he had returned, that he'd slipped back unnoticed. Yet something felt wrong, the rhythm of his words. Harris always spoke in rushed fragments, as though language was secondary to survival. But this version of him drew out the syllables, stretching my name like it wanted to taste it. The air in the room grew dense, pressing harder with each call. I clenched my jaw until pain shot through my teeth, refusing to move, refusing to acknowledge the sound. Minutes bled into hours, and eventually the voice stopped. I didn't sleep, not truly, but drifted in shallow fragments until the alarms buzzed for shift change. The mess hall was emptier than before, several seats vacant, their trays untouched. No one mentioned the missing, but I could read it in their silence. One engineer stared at me too long, his hands trembling around a cup of water. When I asked if he'd heard anything in the night, he only whispered, "We all hear it." His eyes flicked to the cameras in the corners of the room, and he shut his mouth. Whatever hunted us down here wasn't only outside the walls, it was inside our routines, inside the rules themselves. Later that day, I returned to maintenance, unable to ignore the thought of Harris's shredded straps. The generators roared, their vibrations crawling up my arms as I checked dials. Beneath the noise, I thought I heard something softer, a faint echo of my own name. It threaded between the engines, rising and falling like breath, always just at the edge of hearing. I froze, knowing the lamps above my head would dim eventually, knowing the trench didn't need darkness to whisper. My hands shook so badly, I nearly dropped the clipboard, but I forced myself to leave without looking back. If I looked, if I listened too closely, I wasn't sure I'd resist the urge to answer. That night, exhaustion pinned me harder than ever. Alone in the quarters, the silence of missing voices weighed on me more than the trench outside. I strapped in, eyes wide, forcing myself to stare at the lamps as they pulsed dimly. Hours blurred until my body betrayed me. I woke with a start to the sound of my name again, softer this time, as though spoken from inches away. My breath caught when I realized it wasn't Harris's voice anymore, it was my mother's. She sounded exactly as she had the night I left home, tender, worried, almost pleading. My throat tightened, words clawing to escape, but the rule cut sharper than memory. Do not answer. Tears burned my eyes as I lay frozen, the familiar voice weaving through the dark, begging me to speak. The whisper shifted, deepened, took on tones I recognized from old friends, mentors, even my own voice repeating my name back at me. Each one carried perfect cadence, flawless memory, until I could no longer tell if the sounds came from inside my head or the room itself. My nails dug into the straps, and I bit the inside of my cheek until blood filled my mouth just to keep silent. Then for the first time, I heard movement with it, the sound of something brushing along the wall, deliberate and patient, closing the distance between us. I kept my eyes shut, knowing if I saw it, I'd break, I'd answer, and then I'd be gone like Harris. Morning came, though it felt more like survival than a new day. The lamps steadied, casting pale light over the quarters, but the air still carried a weight that hadn't lifted. My body trembled as I unstrapped, my tongue raw from biting down so hard. In the mess hall, more seats were empty, more eyes hollow. When I sat alone, the same engineer slid beside me. His lips barely moved as he whispered, "They're learning your voice now. Before I could ask, he stood and walked away, leaving me with food untouched and fear boiling inside my gut. If the voices knew my name, knew how to shape it into things I loved, then silence might not save me forever. That night, I double-checked every lamp, pressed the straps tighter, and forced my body into a rigid stillness. The room hummed with artificial light, but I no longer trusted it. I didn't trust anything except the next rule, whatever it was, because the voices were coming closer. As my eyes fought the weight of sleep, I heard them again, but this time, they weren't calling from the shadows, they were calling from inside the room. I hadn't even finished strapping in when the walls shuddered like something massive had brushed against them. A groan rippled through the steel, low and heavy, vibrating through my ribs. It wasn't the first time the facility had creaked. It always did in the trench, but this felt intentional, like a knock searching for weak spots. My heart froze as I remembered the next warning in the manual. Rule 4, never investigate noises near the hull. I understood then that curiosity wasn't just dangerous down here. It was an invitation. During the morning shift, whispers about the night spread faster than the rations. Everyone had heard it. The dragging scrape, the hollow thuds that came in intervals, like something circling us. One of the welders muttered that the trench was alive, that it pressed against us with curiosity. The captain silenced him with a glare, but I saw the fear hiding in her clenched jaw. If even she was afraid, we were all already lost. Nobody dared ask where the missing crew had gone. Their absence hung louder than questions. The generators drowned out most sounds in the lower decks. But now I listened differently, hyper-aware of every pitch and thrum. Each shift of machinery might have hidden something unnatural beneath it. My mind replayed the scraping, convinced it had been no accident. I caught myself staring too long at the hull walls, as if expecting fingers or claws to press through. That's when I realized why the rule existed. The noises weren't accidents, they were lures. Something wanted us to come closer. That night, I tried earplugs, pressing them so deep they hurt. For a while it worked. I drifted into shallow half-sleep, lulled by my own heartbeat. Then a new sound woke me, not scraping, but tapping, rhythmic, deliberate, like knuckles knocking in a slow pattern. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the sound seemed to move inside my skull, bouncing from bone to bone. Then, impossibly, it aligned with a voice. My name, the same one that had tried to lure me before. This time it wasn't just whispering, it was knocking, like it expected me to respond in code. My body shook violently against the straps, every nerve urging me to get up, to check the source, to confirm. The thin line between survival and madness blurred, and I dug crescents into my palms just to anchor myself. I repeated the rule over and over, whispering it into the stale air until the knocking slowed, and then stopped. When the lamps flickered back to steady, I realized I'd bitten through my lip in silence. At breakfast, fewer seats remained filled. The ones who stayed avoided each other's eyes, chewing in silence. I spotted the welder who had spoken yesterday, his face pale and drawn. He didn't eat, just clutched a tin mug like it could ground him. I leaned close enough to whisper, asking if he'd heard the knocking. His eyes widened, and his hand shook so violently water spilled over the table. "Don't," he hissed. "That's how they mark you. Once you hear it, they don't stop." Then he shoved away from the table and left, leaving me colder than the trench outside. By the third night, the noise escalated, no longer subtle. It shook the walls with grinding force, rattling the bunks. The lamps pulsed, as if struggling against the vibration. Strapped down, I felt the tremor crawl through my bones, as though something was gnawing on the steel like brittle shell. My lungs constricted under the thought of pressure failing, water rushing in, and the trench swallowing us whole. I buried my face into the straps, praying the rule held true. If I didn't investigate, maybe it would leave. But the knocking came anyway, not at the walls this time. At my door, the sound was softer, more intimate, like fingertips brushing instead of fists. The knock came in threes, pausing, then repeating. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it wasn't random. It was matching my heartbeat. The air chilled, heavy with pressure, as the knocks grew slower, dragging my pulse into rhythm with them. The urge to unbuckle, to check, burned in my veins. My hand hovered over the release strap, shaking uncontrollably. I clenched my teeth, whispering the rule to myself like a prayer. Never investigate noises near the hull. Never, never. The sound stopped, just as suddenly as it began. Silence swallowed the quarters so deeply that for a moment I thought I'd gone deaf. But then came something worse. Breathing. Not mine. Heavy, ragged, inches from my ear. My straps dug painfully into my chest as I fought the urge to scream. I shut my eyes so hard tears leaked out, convinced that opening them would mean seeing something inches away in the dim light. Seconds stretched into eternities, until at last, the lamps brightened, the breath was gone, the room was empty. Morning brought no relief. The welder was missing, his bunk shredded the same way Harris's had been. No one spoke of it. The captain's voice trembled as she announced extra shifts, her gaze darting toward the ceiling, as if expecting it to cave in. The air in the mess hall was so heavy with unspoken terror that I thought I might suffocate. Everyone knew the truth. Rules weren't saving us. They were only delaying what stalked us. Back in maintenance, I caught myself staring at the steel bulkhead, waiting for it to pulse with sound again. The scratching came, faint but real, like nails dragging just out of sight. I gripped the railing so hard my knuckles cracked. Then without warning, the noise shifted. It wasn't random anymore. It was writing. Slow, deliberate scratches spelling letters I couldn't fully catch before they vanished in the hum of the generators. I didn't need the full word to understand the intent. It was spelling my name. That night, I nearly broke. The lamp sputtered in and out, the room breathing with shadows. The knocking at my door returned, softer this time, paired with a voice I trusted most, my own. It repeated my name exactly as I'd whisper it in fear. My body trembled against the straps, torn between defiance and surrender. I wanted to scream, to unbuckle, to demand answers from whatever waited. But I stayed silent, nails digging into my arms, whispering the rule through blood and clenched teeth. And then I heard it. Not at the door, not at the walls, but beneath the floor, a hollow thud, steady and slow, climbing up through the metal beneath my bunk. The sound of something moving inside the facility, searching, hunting. Each knock came closer, rattling through the bed frame, until the final one landed directly below my spine. I held my breath, every muscle locked, waiting for the steel to split open. Instead, silence stretched long enough that my mind tricked me into thinking I'd imagined it. Then a whisper rose from beneath the bunk, muffled but unmistakable. Let me in. When I woke, my bunk felt damp against my back. At first, I thought it was sweat from the constant tension. But when I shifted, a cold slickness spread across my shirt. My heart sank as I pushed a hand against the mattress and pulled it away, glistening. Water. Not a flood, not yet, but a thin, dark seepage threading along the floor beneath us. The rule slammed into my memory like a warning siren. Rule 5. Never touch the water that seeps inside. I pulled my knees tight against my chest, staring at the growing pool. The others noticed it too. Trickles sliding through hairline fractures in the steel, collecting in shallow veins along the walkways. Someone cursed under their breath, but no one dared step down barefoot. The captain barked an order to keep shoes on at all times, her voice sharp enough to slice through the fear that coated the air. But I saw the tremor in her hands as she gripped the railing. If water this deep had found a way inside, even in droplets, it wasn't a good sign. It carried the trench with it. The welders moved fast, patching cracks, sealing edges with resin, working like surgeons desperate to stop a bleed. Their boots splashed lightly against the surface, and I held my breath every time. One of them slipped, his glove dipping into the black sheen before he yanked it back, muttering apologies. For a moment nothing happened. Then he screamed. The glove smoked where it had touched, a thin hiss curling upward as the material shriveled. He tore it off frantically, tossing it into a corner where it dissolved like paper in fire. His hand, bare and pale, shook uncontrollably. By evening the corridors reeked of salt and metal, the scent thick enough to make breathing feel like swallowing blood. No one spoke of the glove, but we all stared at the welder's hand when he wasn't looking. Red lines etched across his skin, as if veins had risen to the surface, spreading further each hour. He kept it wrapped in rags, insisting he was fine, but the hollow look in his eyes told us otherwise. I couldn't stop imagining the trench itself inside him, threading through his body, making him less human with every heartbeat. That night, the water spread faster. Puddles connected into slick trails, reflecting the dim emergency lamps in jagged streaks. I stayed strapped to the bunk, every nerve screaming to lift my feet higher. My ears caught faint trickles, like whispers sliding along the walls. The others shifted uneasily in their bunks, no one daring to speak above a whisper. But then the sound changed. It wasn't dripping anymore. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate, squelching through the thin pools outside our quarters. The lamps flickered as they passed, each step dragging closer. I buried my face into the straps, willing my body to stay still. The wet steps stopped outside my door. A silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until a soft splatter echoed. Water slid under the threshold, curling across the floor like a living thing. My pulse thundered as it reached the legs of the bunk, creeping higher in thin rivulets. The urge to leap up and block it fought against the rule etched into my brain. I forced myself still, whispering through clenched teeth, praying the water wouldn't climb further. When I woke again, the puddle had receded. My bunk was dry, but across the room, one bed was empty. The welder's straps had been sliced open, damp rags discarded in a heap that still glistened faintly. His boots were gone, leaving wet footprints that ended abruptly at the steel wall. No one asked where he went. No one wanted to. The captain only marked his name off the roster and reminded us of the rules. Her voice cracked once, barely audible, but it was enough to tell me she didn't believe they would hold much longer. Over the next day the seepage grew bolder. Drops pattered from overhead like a storm had crept inside, coating the railings in slick residue. The engineers worked double shifts, sealing, patching, cursing under their breath, but the water never stopped. It only found new paths as though it wanted to be here. I caught myself staring at it too long, the way it shimmered strangely under the lamps. Sometimes it didn't look like water at all. Sometimes it looked like eyes, countless and unblinking, staring back. The medic collapsed during her shift, her boots soaked through from standing too long in a shallow pool. We rushed to lift her, but when her hands brushed ours, her skin was colder than death. Her lips moved faintly, whispering words we couldn't catch, as if speaking to something we couldn't see. Then her pupils dilated fully, swallowing the color until only black remained. She smiled faintly, water dribbling from the corners of her mouth, and then she stilled. We sealed her body in the supply locker, but deep down, I knew it wasn't her anymore. It belonged to the trench. That night, I lay awake, clutching my straps so hard my knuckles burned. The water returned, dripping steadily into a puddle beside my bunk. My throat tightened as I realized it was moving, not spreading randomly, moving deliberately, curling toward me like a hand reaching across the floor. My body froze, lungs refusing to draw air, eyes locked on the black sheen creeping closer. It reached the leg of my bunk and began to climb, a trembling rivulet, ascending the metal as if gravity no longer mattered. My breath escaped in a silent prayer, begging it not to touch me. The lamps flickered violently, plunging the room into shadow for seconds at a time. Each time the light returned, the water was higher, closer, first at my knees, then inches from my hands. My chest hammered as I pressed against the straps, as though trying to vanish into the steel frame. Finally, with one last surge, it reached the edge of the mattress. A single bead of it trembled upward, hovering above my skin like a drop suspended in time. Then, just as it was about to fall onto my arm, the lights blazed back to full brightness. The water evaporated instantly, leaving nothing but a faint salt crust on the sheets. I didn't sleep for the rest of that cycle. My eyes burned with exhaustion, but the memory of that drop haunted me. It hadn't behaved like liquid. It had chosen where to move, how to climb, when to stop, and the way it lingered above my arm told me it wasn't just water, it was something else, something alive. The next morning, the captain was gone. No announcement, no farewell. Only her boots remained by the control room door, filled with a thin layer of water that shimmered faintly under the lamps. And just as the panic began to spread among us, the speakers crackled to life with her voice. Only it wasn't her voice anymore. The captain's voice poured through the speakers, thin and static-choked, yet familiar enough to twist my stomach. She called our names one by one, her tone calm, measured, like she had just stepped out for inspection. But I knew she had vanished, leaving only her boots behind, water glimmering inside them. As the sound crackled across the quarters, my blood ran cold with memory. Rule 6. Never answer voices on the intercom. It wasn't a precaution anymore, it was survival. The others froze where they stood, spoons half raised, tools slipping from nervous hands. Hearing her voice made every one of us falter, even if reason screamed against it. The welder's bunkmate muttered, "She's alive," his face twitching with desperate hope, but no one dared echo it. We all remembered the locker door creaking as her soaked boots were sealed away. Still, the intercom persisted, her tone softening, coaxing, telling us she needed help, telling us to open the control room door. Each word hissed through static, but beneath it was something deeper. A second voice layered beneath hers. I tried not to breathe too loudly, afraid it would hear me even through silence. One of the junior engineers, barely older than a teenager, stood trembling near the comm panel, tears streaming down his face. "It sounds like her," he whispered, and before anyone could stop him, his hand lifted toward the button. The mess hall erupted in sharp whispers, hissing at him to stop, but desperation carved into his face. "If it's really her, we can't just ignore it," he choked. Then his thumb pressed down. The speaker crackled louder, bursting with a screech that sent shivers crawling over my skin. Her voice filled the hall, stronger now, layered with a resonance that seemed too deep for human lungs. "Thank you," it said, slow and drawn, dragging the words across the air like chains over stone. The boy smiled through his tears, thinking he'd saved her, but the rest of us knew better. The lights dimmed until only the glow of the intercom panel illuminated the room, and in that faint glow, I saw shadows crawling across the walls, bending against the light instead of with it. The boy gasped, stumbling back as his shadow twisted unnaturally, separating from his movements by half a second. He cried out, clutching his chest as the darkness pooled beneath him, rising like liquid. His scream tore through the mess hall as the shadow swallowed him whole, leaving behind nothing but his shoes and a faint puddle shimmering with brine. The intercom fell silent, the static cutting off so abruptly it felt like the air had been vacuumed from the room. No one dared move until the lamps flickered back. By then the boy was gone. From that moment, silence became our shield. Every time the speakers crackled, we froze, eyes darting, refusing to answer. Sometimes the voice pleaded, calling out like the captain begging for help. Other times, it grew angry, snarling our names with venom, promising we wouldn't survive without listening. Each attempt felt more precise, more familiar, as if it studied us, learning our fears and using them against us. The worst was when it began mimicking people who were still alive, repeating their voices perfectly. I once heard my own tone on the intercom, whispering to open the door. Sleep was impossible. The voice found us at all hours, worming through static, no matter how low we turned the dials. We tried cutting power to the system, ripping wires from panels, even smashing a speaker in desperation. None of it worked. The voice still bled through, louder when we resisted, quieter when we held our breath. It wasn't machinery, it was something else using the system as its mouth, something that wanted us to speak back, so it could crawl inside. On the fourth day, the mechanic lost control. His nerves shattered under the weight of silence, and when the voice called his mother's name through the speakers, he broke. Tears streaming, he screamed into the intercom, begging for forgiveness, begging for mercy. The voice answered, gentle as silk, promising him release. He unbuckled himself from the mess table and staggered toward the bulkhead door, following the sound. We tried to grab him, but his strength surged with desperation, tearing free from our grip. He yanked the door open and stepped into the black hallway beyond. We never saw him again. Only his screams echoed for hours, thin and hollow, as if coming from miles below us. After that, we stopped trying to save anyone who answered. We strapped each other down during rest cycles, gagging the weakest among us, so they couldn't speak even if tempted. The paranoia turned us against each other, every whispered word a potential betrayal. I couldn't trust the silence anymore, because silence meant waiting for the intercom to come alive. And when it did, I couldn't trust the voices it carried, because sometimes they were ours. One night, the voice shifted tactics. It didn't beg or threaten, it laughed. A low bubbling laugh that echoed through every corridor at once, vibrating the walls, rattling the loose bolts. My skin prickled as I realized it wasn't just in the speakers anymore. It was in the hull itself, reverberating through the steel, crawling into my bones. I clenched my teeth so hard, I tasted blood, certain that if I let go of silence, if I answered in any way, it would hear me and find its way in. The laughter stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving a vacuum in the air that made every breath feel stolen. The lamp sputtered, then steadied. My heart still thundered when the comm panel beside me clicked on, the red light glowing faintly. For a moment, only static filled the air. Then, in perfect mimicry, I heard my own voice whisper, "Are you there?" Every muscle locked, terror colder than the trench water flooding my veins. The panel hissed again, the voice repeating, louder this time, "Are you there?" The words mirrored my own tone perfectly, down to the quiver in my breath. It wasn't asking me, it was testing me, daring me to respond, to blur the line between my voice and its own. The others stared at me in horror, as though answering wasn't just my risk, it would doom us all. I clamped my jaw shut, gripping the edge of the table until my knuckles ached. The voice repeated once more, sharp and commanding now, "Answer me." My ears rang as though pressure was building inside the facility itself, forcing me to obey. The lamps dimmed to a faint glow, shadows stretching across the room, reaching toward me like claws. The air pressed heavier, crushing my chest, my lungs screaming for relief. My lips trembled against the gag I'd tied myself with, terrified that even a whimper might count as a reply. Then the static cut off, silence returned. The lamp steadied, the air lightened, just enough for me to drag in a gasp. Relief almost toppled me from the chair. But before I could breathe fully, before I could believe it was over, the intercom light blinked once more. And this time, the voice didn't ask a question. It gave a command. "Open the door." The order on the intercom still burned in my ears when the lamps brightened to reveal the mess hall tables. Trays of food had been left untouched, cold rations sealed in silver packets, stale bread curling at the edges. My stomach twisted with hunger, the ache gnawing so loud it drowned the silence. That's when I remembered another warning carved into the manual. Rule 7, never eat after midnight down here. At the time it had sounded like superstition, but the trench had taught me superstition was only another word for survival. The hunger was worst in the off hours, when shifts blurred into endless cycles of dim light and stale air. No clocks, no windows, only the digital timer on the mess wall to tell us when day ended and night began. After midnight, something about the air changed. thicker, saltier, as if the trench pressed harder against the hull. The food tasted different too, sharper, metallic, carrying an aftertaste like rust. The first time I noticed, I spat it out, gagging. The others told me it was my nerves, but I could see the same doubt in their faces. That night, the cook didn't follow the rule. Exhausted from double shifts, he heated a bowl of protein stew long after midnight struck. The smell drifted down the corridors, richer than anything we'd eaten in weeks, filling the air with warmth that made every stomach growl. I watched him from my bunk, spoon scraping slowly as he ate in silence, eyes half-lidded from fatigue. At first nothing happened. Then his chewing slowed. He froze, spoon halfway to his lips, staring at the bowl like it had changed shape in his hands. When I crept closer, I saw it too. The stew wasn't food anymore. It rippled like liquid skin, shifting, forming faint outlines beneath the surface. Tiny pale shapes squirmed in the broth, pressing against the edge of the bowl as though trying to escape. The cook gagged, dropping the spoon, but it was too late. His throat convulsed violently, body seizing, as something pushed upward from inside him. He clawed at his mouth, retching a stream of black brine that splattered across the floor, writhing with thin, eel-like things that evaporated before our eyes. His body slumped forward, empty bowl clattering to the ground, his lips still slick with whatever had climbed through him. After that, no one dared eat after midnight, no matter how hungry we became. But hunger doesn't care about rules. It creeps into your bones, fogs your mind, makes you desperate enough to take risks. I tied myself to the bunk at night, just to stop from sleepwalking to the mess. Even strapped down, I could smell it. The rations, the stew, the faint sweetness of fruit long gone. My imagination tortured me, conjuring feasts from memories, until my mouth watered so violently, I nearly choked on it. The others grew restless too. I heard them whisper in the bunks, arguing whether the rule was real or fear playing tricks. Some swore they'd eaten late before and survived. Others snapped back, reminding them what happened to the cook. The debate grew louder each night, until paranoia divided us further. Hunger was worse than fear. It made enemies of us all. I caught one man sneaking crumbs into his mouth after midnight, hiding them under his pillow. The next morning, his bunk was empty, sheets soaked through with salt water, his straps neatly unbuckled, as if he'd left willingly. I forced myself to endure the gnawing hunger, repeating the rule until the words dulled into mantra. But one night, exhaustion overwhelmed me. I drifted into half-sleep, and when I woke, I was already in the mess hall, fingers clutching a ration bar. Panic shot through me as I realized I'd undone the straps myself without remembering. Midnight had passed. The timer glared its red digits at me. My stomach growled viciously, body begging for the bite. My hand trembled so violently the wrapper tore. I stared at the bar, its texture shifting under the flickering lamps. For a moment, it looked like food. Then it pulsed. The surface writhed, veins crawling beneath it, a faint heartbeat thrumming through the wrapper. My stomach twisted, not with hunger now but with revulsion. I dropped it, the bar smacking against the steel table with a wet slap, oozing brine that trickled toward the floor. The smell hit me like a wave of rot and seawater, choking the air. I staggered back, gagging, but before I could flee, the intercom hissed alive. My voice echoed back at me, calm and steady, saying, "Eat it." I bolted from the hall, heart pounding, but the smell clung to me like oil. Back in the quarters, I strapped myself down harder than ever, fighting the urge that still burned in my gut. Every sound in the dark turned into the crinkle of ration wrappers, every shadow into bowls of steaming stew. My body screamed louder than my mind, but I kept whispering the rule until my throat was raw. Eventually, exhaustion drowned hunger, dragging me into shallow sleep. When I woke, I wasn't sure how much time had passed. The mess timer flickered faintly in the hall beyond, digits warped, unreadable. The lamps cast the tables in dull half-light, and on each tray sat steaming plates of food, fresh bread, roasted meat, fruits that glistened with dew. The smell filled every corner of the facility, intoxicating, perfect. My stomach twisted painfully, but terror gripped me harder. None of it was possible, none of it was real. Then the voices started, not from the intercom this time, from the food itself. The bread whispered promises of warmth. The fruit called my name sweetly. The meat hummed in low tones that rattled my chest. I pressed my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, but the voices only grew louder, seeping into my skull, filling me with unbearable need. My straps dug into my arms as I thrashed, every nerve screaming for me to run into the mess and obey. When the lamps dimmed further, shadows stretched across the hall, and the food moved. Slowly, deliberately, it slid closer to the bunks, plates scraping against steel without hands to push them. My stomach clenched in horror as the scent thickened, choking, drowning out thought. I twisted violently against the straps, begging them to hold. One plate slid to the edge of my bunk, steam curling upward, fruit glistening like blood under the lamps. And then, in the silence between my screams and the groan of steel, I heard chewing, not from the hall, from the bunk beside mine. The chewing beside my bunk grew louder, wet and deliberate, until I forced myself to glance sideways. What I saw didn't make sense. The straps across the next bed were still pulled tight, but the figure within them writhed violently, head jerking with each bite, as if devouring something invisible. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, pupils blown wide, and every time his jaw snapped shut, I heard the crunch of bone. My breath froze in my chest as another memory clawed its way forward. Rule 8. Never follow voices into unlit corridors. Suddenly, the whispers from the food made sense. They weren't calling me, they were luring us deeper. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping the chewing would stop, but the sound spread instead, multiplying. Soon it echoed through the quarters, each bunk filled with the same guttural feast. My own hunger twisted violently, driving bile up my throat, but I clenched my teeth and pressed my face into the mattress. The lamps above flickered, buzzing weakly, until the hall beyond sank into total darkness. That was when the whispers returned. Clearer now, no longer the food but voices, familiar ones, calling softly from the corridors, promising safety, promising escape. One of the strapped figures answered. His muffled voice cracked with desperation, begging them to wait. Then I heard buckles snapping loose, one after another, though no one had moved to free him. His steps dragged across the floor, heavy and unsteady, toward the dark hallway. I tried to call out, to stop him, but my throat closed around the words. The darkness swallowed him whole, and a moment later, his scream tore through the trench. It was short, cut off mid-breath, leaving behind only silence. The silence didn't last. More voices filled the dark, overlapping, coaxing, sometimes gentle, sometimes cruel. They called each of our names in turn, perfectly mimicking tones of people we'd trusted back on the surface. My mother's voice drifted down the corridor, soft and loving, telling me she was waiting just past the next corner. My body strained against the straps, muscles aching with the instinct to run toward her. I bit my tongue hard enough to taste iron, forcing the illusion away. Still the voices swirled, louder, more insistent, until the entire station hummed with their chorus. I couldn't hold on much longer. Every fiber of me wanted to believe, wanted to chase those voices into the dark. I shut my eyes and prayed for the lamps to return, but instead I felt movement. Cold air brushed my face as if the corridor itself leaned closer, breathing against my skin. Then I heard shuffling, the sound of more bunks unbuckling, more feet dragging toward the hall. I dared to peek, just in time to see two more crewmates vanish into the black, their figures dissolving as though the shadows swallowed them. Their voices joined the chorus almost instantly, echoing back from within. I whispered the rule under my breath, clinging to it like a lifeline. Never follow voices into unlit corridors. But rules were only words, and words couldn't drown out the sound of my father's laugh, drifting from the hallway with uncanny precision. My heart cracked inside my chest, pulse slamming against my ribs as his voice urged me forward. My straps strained against my desperate pull, but the steel buckles held firm. The darkness seemed to sense my struggle, pressing closer, smothering the faint glow of the bunk lamps. The chewing stopped all at once. I froze, straining my ears, but only the voices remained, weaving through the corridors like currents. Then something else stirred, a scrape along the ceiling, slow and deliberate. Dust rained down on my bunk, scattering across my skin like cold sand. I craned my neck upward, just as the lamp sputtered twice, and then died completely. The trench swallowed every trace of light, plunging us into suffocating black. That was when I realized the voices weren't drifting from far away anymore. They were right beside me. "Unbuckle," they whispered. My body went rigid, hands trembling against the straps. The voice was my own, identical down to the rhythm, whispering in the exact tone I used when trying to calm myself. I clenched my eyes shut, tears burning hot against my lids, refusing to listen. But the whisper pressed closer, lips brushing my ear, though no one was there. "You'll starve if you don't come with me," it coaxed, each word slithering into my skull. My jaw clenched so hard, I thought my teeth might shatter. I screamed into the mattress, hoping the noise would drown it out, but the whisper only grew louder. Then the straps loosened. I hadn't touched them, I swear I hadn't, but the buckles slid free, as if invisible hands unclasped them one by one. My chest seized with panic, limbs flailing as the binding slipped away. In seconds I was free, sprawled across the bunk, darkness pressing down like a living thing. The voices cheered, dozens of them, welcoming me in unison. My body rose against my will, muscles jerking as if strings guided me toward the corridor. I dug my nails into the mattress, but something tugged harder, dragging me across the steel floor. I kicked, screamed, begged, but the corridor swallowed my sounds instantly. The air grew colder the closer I drew, whispers curling like smoke around my throat. My fingers caught on the lip of the doorway, skin peeling as I clung desperately, but the pull was relentless. Just as the darkness surged to engulf me, a faint glow returned, emergency lamps sputtering weakly back to life. The light cut across the corridor, and for the first time I saw what hid within. Shapes writhed in the shadows, dozens of them, human forms twisted wrong, limbs bent backward, jaws unhinged too far. Their faces flickered between people I knew, friends, family, crew, shifting endlessly, never staying still. They beckoned with pale hands, lips splitting into grotesque smiles as they whispered in voices I loved. My grip faltered, mind fracturing under the sight. I felt myself sliding into them, into the dark, ready to vanish like the others. And then out of nowhere, a hand grabbed my arm. It was one of the surviving crew, eyes wide with terror, pulling me back into the bunk room with all his strength. Together we slammed the door shut, sealing the corridor behind heavy locks. The whispers cut off instantly, leaving only our ragged breaths and the creak of strained steel. For a moment I thought we were safe, but then came the sound of knuckles rapping against the sealed door, slow and deliberate, followed by my own voice, calling from the other side. The pounding on the sealed door grew louder, and with each strike the metal shivered beneath our hands. My own voice kept calling from the other side, soft one moment and furious the next, shifting between begging and demanding, until I wanted to tear my ears off. The man beside me, a junior medic I barely knew, whispered through clenched teeth that the lights wouldn't last, that we couldn't stay locked in forever. My stomach twisted in knots then, not just from fear but from hunger gnawing deep inside. That was when I remembered the warning scrawled in the manual, in uneven letters. Rule 9, never eat food you didn't prepare yourself. The memory made me shiver, because I hadn't eaten anything of my own making in days. Most meals came sealed in trays, prepped by unseen hands in another section of the station, delivered like offerings at scheduled times. I thought of the whispers that rose from that food before, of Harris and the way his jaw snapped hungrily at nothing. My stomach growled anyway, betraying me, the sound filling the bunk room like a second voice. The medic heard it too, his eyes flicking toward me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Neither of us trusted the rations anymore, but neither of us could last much longer without them. Hours crawled by before the pounding stopped. The silence it left behind was worse, thick and waiting. At some point, exhaustion dragged us both into uneasy half-sleep. When I woke, the medic was gone. The door was still sealed, lights still flickering, but his bunk lay empty, straps undone neatly as if he had unbuckled them himself. A single tray sat on the floor where he'd been, steam curling faintly upward from food I hadn't seen delivered. My gut cramped violently, saliva pooling in my mouth at the scent of something warm and savory. My rational mind screamed at me not to touch it, but hunger clawed harder than reason. I crawled closer on shaky hands and knees, staring at the tray. It looked perfect. Eggs, bread, even fruit, though I hadn't seen fruit since we descended weeks ago. Each item glistened with impossible freshness, colors too vivid for the sterile gray around us. My nose filled with sweetness and salt all at once, memories of surface breakfasts rising unbidden. I reached out before jerking my hand back, nails scraping against the floor. The medic hadn't prepared this. I hadn't prepared this. Then whose hands had? The hunger didn't care. It drove me forward again, fingers trembling as they hovered over the bread. Just as I touched it, the lights above flickered violently, plunging the room into near darkness. In that blink of shadow, the food shifted. The bread pulsed faintly, as though veins ran through it. The eggs bubbled, yolks bulging outward like eyes straining to see me. When the light returned, everything looked normal again, steaming softly, inviting me closer. My chest heaved with disgust and longing tangled together, my willpower thinning to threads. A faint sound cut through my haze, a shuffle outside the bunkroom door, followed by the scrape of nails dragging along the steel. My heart leapt to my throat, but then a voice spoke, calm and familiar. It was the medic, calling gently, saying he had found a safer place, urging me to eat and regain my strength before joining him. I pressed my palms against my ears, shaking my head furiously, but his words seeped through like water through cracks. He told me the food would make me stronger, that it wasn't dangerous, that the rule didn't matter down here. I squeezed my eyes shut and repeated the rule silently, clinging to it like a prayer. But the food kept steaming. The smell grew stronger, twisting around me, filling my lungs until I gagged. My stomach cramped so hard I nearly doubled over, every nerve screaming for me to take just one bite. My fingers twitched against the tray, the bread warm against my skin. The whisper outside laughed then, low and knowing, as though it could feel my resolve splintering. My hand shook, bringing the bread closer to my lips before I forced it down again, nails tearing the crust instead of my teeth. The laughter grew louder. I hurled the tray across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud, and when it landed, the contents had changed. Not eggs, not bread, not fruit. Flesh, raw, glistening, piled like offerings, each piece bearing faint grooves of human fingerprints. I recoiled violently, bile rising, chest heaving as I scrambled backward. The laughter outside roared now, multiple voices joining in chorus, mocking, hungry. The food had never been food. It had been bait, waiting for me to break the rule. The lights sputtered once more, weaker than ever, and I realized with bone-deep dread that they would soon fail completely. Shadows pressed in at the corners of the room, and in them, I saw shapes writhing, mouths open wide, teeth flashing as they licked at the seams of the bunkroom door. My only hope was to stay awake, stay strapped down, and resist both hunger and voices. But my strength was gone, my body trembling with weakness. I knew if I didn't eat something soon, I'd collapse, and the trench would claim me without mercy. For hours I lay there, shivering, whispering the rule over and over until the words blurred into nonsense. When exhaustion finally pulled me under, I dreamed of sunlight, of meals with my family, of laughter that wasn't hollow. Then I woke with something wet pressed against my lips. My eyes shot open to see the medic leaning over me, his face pale and eyes glazed. He held a chunk of meat in his trembling hand, forcing it toward my mouth, whispering that it was the only way to survive. His voice was wrong, too smooth, too rehearsed, but his strength was real. I thrashed against him, clawing at his arm, but his grip was iron. The meat brushed my teeth, warm and slick, and a scream tore from my throat as I bucked hard, sending us both tumbling from the bunk. He hit the floor with a crack, but when I looked again, he was gone, vanished into the shadows, leaving only the meat smeared across the steel. My breath came ragged, chest heaving as I stared at the smear, realizing with horror that the fibers weren't animal at all. They were strands of clothing mixed with flesh. Someone from the crew had already been fed to us. The bunkroom door groaned under unseen weight, hinges straining as if something pressed against it from outside. The laughter had stopped, replaced by silence so thick it made my ears ring. Then a voice broke through at last, soft and terrible. It was my own, whispering that I'd already eaten in my sleep. I froze at the sound of my own voice, whispering that I had already eaten in my sleep. My pulse slammed so hard against my ribs, I thought the trench itself could hear it. The bunkroom was silent. Otherwise, shadows still writhing faintly at the edges where the lights failed to reach. I clung to the mattress, whispering the rules like talismans, reminding myself of each one I had obeyed, each one I had nearly broken. That was when another line from the manual surfaced in my thoughts. Rule 10. Never open the observation windows after midnight. I didn't know why the warning struck me so sharply then, but the timing made my skin crawl. The door groaned once more under the weight outside, and then silence. Whatever pressed there had withdrawn, leaving only my ragged breathing and the failing hum of the lamps. Minutes bled into hours, or maybe seconds. Time meant nothing anymore. Eventually, exhaustion forced me into a restless doze, and when I woke, the bunkroom was brighter. Someone had restored the main lights, but I wasn't alone. A figure stood by the far wall, half hidden in the glow, facing the sealed window shutter. His posture was strange, stiff, like he was listening to something on the other side. My chest tightened when I realized it was Harris. "Harris," I whispered, my voice breaking in the silence. He didn't turn, didn't move, just rested a trembling hand against the shutter's handle. My body reacted before my brain, dragging me across the floor toward him. The closer I came, the colder the air grew, as if the trench outside had seeped through the steel. Harris's lips moved soundlessly, and I realized he wasn't ignoring me. He was answering something only he could hear. My stomach dropped when I heard it faintly too. A murmur behind the window, low and insistent, like voices traveling through miles of water. I lunged, grabbing his arm, yanking it away from the handle. His skin burned with unnatural cold, as though the deep had replaced his blood. He turned to me then, finally meeting my eyes, and I wished he hadn't. His pupils were gone, eyes milk white and glowing faintly in the sterile light. His mouth twisted into a grin that didn't belong to him, and he hissed through his teeth that I was too late, that they had already seen me. His gaze flicked back to the shutter, and his body strained violently toward it. I tightened my grip, screaming at him to stop, reminding him of the rule, but he only laughed, a sound hollow and bubbling, like air escaping broken lungs. I dragged him back from the shutter and slammed him against the wall, panic fueling strength I didn't know I had. For a moment his body convulsed, twitching like a marionette with cut strings, and then he went still. His eyes cleared, normal again, and tears streaked down his face. He begged me not to let him touch the handle again, voice trembling with raw fear. I nodded, swearing I wouldn't, but already the whispers beyond the steel grew louder, overlapping now, many voices pressing against the thin divide. They called Harris by name, then me, their tones so familiar it twisted my insides. They knew us, and they wanted us to look. We retreated from the shutter, strapping ourselves back into the bunks, trying to pretend the voices weren't there. But they didn't fade, they grew. The steel groaned softly, as if bending under the pressure of unseen currents. I shut my eyes and pressed my palms over my ears, but the voices seeped through anyway, weaving into my thoughts. They promised truth, promised answers, promised release. They told me the trench wasn't holding us captive, that it was begging us to see. Harris whimpered in the bunk beside me, repeating the rule like a mantra. His voice cracked, but he never stopped. Then the lights flickered, and the shutter groaned. My eyes flew open to see the handle turning slowly on its own, as though responding to invisible hands outside. Harris screamed, thrashing violently against his straps, begging me to stop it. I tore free of my own bindings and hurled myself across the room, grabbing the handle before it could lift fully. The cold that rushed through the metal nearly froze my skin, but I forced it back down, bolting the lock in place. The voices shrieked in unison, their harmony breaking into a cacophony that rattled the glass. I stumbled backward, ears ringing, as the window pulsed faintly with light. I don't know what saved us then, whether it was the locks holding or the voices retreating, but eventually the sound ebbed away, leaving only silence. Harris sagged in his bunk, sobbing uncontrollably. I slumped against the wall, my chest heaving, hands still numb from the cold, but the reprieve didn't last. Hours later, the voices returned. This time, they whispered more softly, coaxing, almost apologetic. They told me Harris was infected, that I couldn't trust him, that he was already theirs. I shook my head furiously, but when I looked at him, I saw it too. His skin had grown paler, veins dark against his arms, his breath shallow. He met my gaze and whispered that he was sorry, that he couldn't hold out much longer. The whispers pressed harder, insisting I open the window, just a crack, to let them take him and spare me. I buried my face in my hands, rocking back and forth, chanting the rule under my breath. Never open the observation windows after midnight. But I could feel my resolve thinning, just as it had with the food. The voices promised it would be painless, that I would survive if I just obeyed them instead of the manual. They told me the manual was written to trap us, that the rules were lies meant to keep us blind. Their words sank deep, poisoning every thought, until I wasn't sure anymore which rules protected me and which betrayed me. At some point, exhaustion claimed me again. When I woke, the bunk beside me was empty. The straps hung loose, cold air sweeping across the floor. The shutter handle was halfway turned. My stomach dropped, bile rising, as I stumbled forward to slam it shut. The steel was icy under my hands, frost forming along the seams. Beyond the glass, a faint glow pulsed in the water, growing brighter with each passing second. Shadows moved within it, shapes too vast and too fluid to comprehend, pressing closer, their outlines distorting against the window. The whispers stopped. In their place came a single sound, a heartbeat, slow and thunderous, reverberating through the steel, syncing with my own pulse. I couldn't look away, even as terror froze me in place. My hands shook against the handle, torn between slamming it shut or pulling it open. The glow brightened, shapes pressing closer, and then something tapped the glass from the other side. The tap on the glass echoed like a gunshot in the silence, and I felt every muscle in my body tense until they ached. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, just stared at the faint outline pressing against the window from the other side. The glow outside pulsed brighter, illuminating shifting figures that scraped the glass with unseen hands. My skin crawled as another memory from the manual surfaced, harsher than the others, written in bold, uneven letters. Rule 11. If you hear your own voice behind you, do not turn around. My chest tightened, because if the trench had already stolen my voice once, it would do it again. The handle beneath my palms quivered violently, trying to twist upward, and I slammed my weight against it, locking my arms until they shook. Something scraped along the glass, slow and deliberate, and though no sound should have passed through, I swore I heard breathing from the other side. Then a whisper slid into my ear, not through the glass, not from the corridor, but from directly behind me. It was my voice, calm and steady, whispering that the window was safe, that I needed to look at what waited beyond. My blood turned to ice, and every instinct screamed at me to turn. I clenched my jaw, eyes fixed forward, but the whisper persisted. "Why are you ignoring me?" it asked, sharper now, tinged with annoyance. My knees trembled beneath me as the words coiled deeper, winding through my thoughts like tendrils. The voice shifted tones, mimicking my laugh, then my cries, each one crueler than the last. I pressed harder against the handle, refusing to look back, but the weight of that unseen presence loomed over my shoulders, so close I could almost feel its breath. The rule was all that kept me still, my mind replaying it endlessly. The glow outside dimmed suddenly, swallowed by black, but the whisper behind me didn't fade. It grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like hundreds of versions of me speaking at once. They argued, shouted, begged, each voice pulling me in a different direction. My ears rang with the chaos, my vision blurring as my will unraveled. I thought of Harris, of the medic, of all the crew who had vanished into voices, and wondered if this was how it had claimed them. One slip, one backward glance, and they were gone. My nails dug into the cold steel, skin splitting, blood smearing across the handle as I clung to the rule. Then the whisper changed again. It spoke in my father's voice, then my mother's, then voices of friends long dead, weaving together everything I had ever trusted. My heart wrenched violently, tears spilling unchecked as the weight pressed harder. It told me the rules were lies, that I had already broken them, that I was already theirs. The words sank so deep that for a moment I almost believed them. My grip faltered, shoulders trembling, body straining to twist. I nearly turned. I nearly looked. A sudden crash shattered the trance, the observation shutter slamming itself closed, bolts locking with a sound like final judgment. I stumbled backward, falling hard against the bunk, gasping for air like I'd surfaced from drowning. The voices behind me went silent, all at once, leaving only the hum of the failing lights. My ears rang in the quiet, my body shaking with exhaustion and terror. I didn't know if I had survived by resisting, or if something had simply decided to let me live a little longer. Either way, I hadn't turned, and I clung to that as the only victory left. The hours that followed bled together, each one heavier than the last. I drifted in and out of consciousness, too weak to move, too terrified to sleep. Every time my eyes closed, I felt that presence looming just behind me, waiting for the smallest mistake. Hunger gnawed at my insides, thirst cracked my lips, and still the rules replayed in my head, the only tether keeping me sane. One by one, I remembered each of them, and with each came the faces of those who had broken them. Harris, the medic, the others, their voices still echoed faintly in the walls, reminders of what awaited me if I failed. At some point, I realized the station was no longer humming. The generators had gone silent, the air still and heavy, the lights flickering weaker by the minute. Darkness crept steadily closer, smothering what little safety remained. I tried to rise, to search for help, but my body wouldn't obey. My strength was gone, my limbs shaking too violently to carry me forward. All I could do was sit strapped in place, staring at the shuttered window, waiting for whatever came next. The silence pressed harder, deeper, until I swore I could hear the ocean itself breathing around me. That was when I heard it again. My voice behind me, soft at first, coaxing, familiar. "You can't stay strapped in forever," it whispered. My spine stiffened, muscles locking as every nerve screamed at me not to turn. The straps dug into my skin, pinning me in place, but my head twitched despite myself, straining against the urge. The whisper grew sharper, angrier, echoing through the bunk room like a chorus. "Look at me," it demanded, words tearing through the silence. My teeth ground together, eyes burning as I fought the compulsion. The darkness thickened. The lights sputtered their last, plunging everything into black. My breathing echoed too loudly, masking the sound of what shifted just behind me. My heart slammed against my ribs, each beat threatening to split me open. The whisper pressed closer, lips grazing the back of my ear, though nothing touched me. "If you don't turn," it hissed, "you'll never know what you really are." My vision blurred with tears, every part of me unraveling under the weight of the unknown. I stayed frozen, clinging to the rule with the last threads of my sanity. I didn't turn, I couldn't. But as the silence stretched, a single thought rooted itself in my mind, more dangerous than any voice. What if the rule was never meant to protect me? What if the truth waiting behind me was the only way out? My body trembled violently, trapped between terror and temptation, the question clawing deeper with each breath. I closed my eyes, whispering the rule over and over until it became meaningless. The whisper fell silent, leaving only my heartbeat echoing in the void. I don't know how long I sat there, strapped and shivering, waiting for something to happen, maybe minutes, maybe forever. And then softly, from just over my shoulder, I heard myself breathe in. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.